74 players, count them, were picked in the 2022 CFL Draft. It wasn't a deep class, but what were the main takeaways from the Canadian talent grab, fellas?
I think my main takeaway is I need to stop trying to figure out where everyone's going in this draft. That's my main takeaway. It's time to retire. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to retire from making my mock drafts months in advance. Those always do really well. People like the first mock and the second mock, but day of the draft, when the smoke screens are up and teams are purposely trying to confuse you and doing it quite successfully, I might add, it can grow frustrating. But that aside, I thought the actual draft night was solid. I liked a lot of the picks that were made. I didn't think that anybody fell egregiously down the draft board. I also don't think we got a huge reach in the first two rounds as we'd seen in previous years. And so all in all, I think the teams did well. How about you, JC?
Well, we didn't have any major reaches in the first two rounds because Brock Sunderland isn't in the league anymore, so he can't pick Cole Nelson at number 5. But I agree with your sentiments there, Hodge. There was some surprising picks, some things that weren't projected to land where they ended up going, but none of them I hated. I liked Zach Pelahos at number 2 to the Red Blacks. I like Nathan Cherry at number 3 to the Lions, which is not something a lot of people expected, but I think is a sneaky good selection. And then with some of the trades that we saw leading up to the draft, obviously the Montreal Alouettes going up to number 1, the Elks grabbing the 4th pick and the 8th pick. Those are some solid selections there as well, with Tyrell Richards on the top of the board, Enoch Maconzo and Trey Ford going to Edmonton.
How did it take us this long for Trey Ford's name to be mentioned? All right, this is the highlight of the draft, guys. Hodge, you got the great stat from the guru, Steve Daniels. The first time a Canadian quarterback has been selected in the first round of a CFL draft since 1980. My goodness, man. Ford making a bit of history here. And yes, he does have 2 NFL rookie minicamp invites. So it is somewhat of a gamble. And we have seen guys go down there and earn contracts out of those. So Ford will get in front of the Baltimore Ravens brass and also the New York Giants. So there's an opportunity for him to potentially earn a contract there. But I'm really intrigued to see what happens here if he comes back to Edmonton and is with the Elks this season or even potentially down the road. It'd be great and a much better story for him to get signed to an NFL contract by the Ravens or the Giants. But that pick in and of itself, in my mind, is the headliner of the entire draft, because finally we get a quarterback in the first round. People want to talk about how offensive linemen fly off the board in the CFL draft and how that makes it boring. Well, you had just about every position represented highly in this draft, and you had a sexy quarterback to go along with it as well. So nobody should be complaining.
Yeah, there were more receivers taken in the first round than offensive linemen. 3 pass catchers, 2 blockers, which is great. And I'll say this too: we've seen this trend grow organically over the last 3 years. We saw Michael O'Connor at a UBC go in the 3rd round 2 years ago. We saw Nathan Rourke the year after that go in the 2nd round. So those quarterbacks have been creeping up and up. And I'll say this too, when you take into consideration the fact that the ratio is likely to change, at least according to the rumors that are out there, to have mandated 3 players on both sides of the ball, right? Lots of players stack their Canadians on the offensive side of the ball, largely on the offensive line. Well, if teams suddenly need to all start a minimum of 3 Canadians defensively, then I think this draft is going to change even more, right? Some of those linebackers, some of those defensive linemen, some of those defensive backs that typically fall to rounds 2 and 3, while teams, historically have scooped up the offensive linemen in round 1. I think that trend is also going to change. And I think that's great because if you look back at old drafts, there's lots of times, even as recently as 5, 7, 10 years ago, where really good players at those positions go in round 2 and round 3 simply because everyone's scared to not get their offensive lineman in round 1. So I think the draft is starting to reflect the talent that is available more so than arbitrarily plugging positional holes. And I think that's a win, not just for fans, but for anybody who's not even a CFL fan, just a fan of drafts. More variety, more intrigue in the first round is what this event really needs.
You mentioned the potential for the ratio to change, Hodge, and I was actually a little bit surprised that didn't play more a factor into how some of the teams ran their draft board in this draft, because if you look at rosters across the league, there are not a lot of teams that are prepared for a 3-3 starter split with the ratio. A lot of teams that need to add defensive talent. And now I think what this indicates is that if that rule comes into place, there will be a 1-year waiting period before it's enacted. But I was expecting a few more teams to grab defensive talent earlier in the draft and in more volume in order to potentially prepare down the line for that switch.
All right. I know you guys want to talk about some of your favorite classes overall in the draft, or if you felt there were some value guys. So circle back to JC first, because this was his idea. Mr. Abbott, who are some of your top, let's say, value picks in the draft?
Well, when it comes to value, I think my number one pick in that regard was Zach Herzog, the safety out of Hillsdale College. He's a tiny dude, but I just love the way he plays. I love his intelligence. I love his athleticism. The Saskatchewan Roughriders steal him in the 7th round, and the player that I compare him to is Stavros Katsantonis, who has a very similar build, similar athletic profile, and plays with a similar level of intelligence. He was selected by the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the mid rounds of his draft and goes on to be a starter on that team for the Grey Cup last season. I think Zach Herzog maybe isn't the same caliber of player as Stavros Katsantonis, but I think he can have a similar trajectory, and the Riders got a steal in round 7.
I've got a written article up on the site right now called the 5 Best Value Selections from the 2022 CFL Draft. So I'd encourage people to go check that out. I'm not going to address a player. I'm going to address a team. I think actually 2 teams. I don't think anybody had bad drafts. I think BC did a really good job of addressing the line of scrimmage, which is something they had not done well enough over the last 5-10 years. I liked what Edmonton did in the first round. But the 2 teams I'm going to point out here, I think Toronto got the most talent overall. Gregor McKellar, rising offensive lineman. Deontay Knight, excellent versatile defensive lineman. Daniel Adeboboye, potential starter at running back. Enoch Penny-Larea, one of the best athletes in the draft. I liked what they did. But the other team I'm going to say is the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Now, this team had 1 pick in the top 36, which is not a lot to make hay from. But the thing people need to remember is that trade they made with Edmonton, I loved. They got Kyle Saxelid, who could be their starting left tackle. They got Grant McDonald, who I see as a future starter at Will or Mike, both under contract for the next 2 seasons. Really good young Canadians. If you add those 2 players into their draft class, which also included Anthony Federico, who I really like, Jared Beeksma, versatile linebacker from the University of Guelph, who could long snap as well, I think Hamilton did great work, because frankly, I'm not sure there was a player certainly along the offensive line of Kyle Saxelid's level in this draft, and Grant McDonald is going to be ready to make plays that I don't think any linebacker in this draft is going to be making as a rookie.
Other than Trey Ford, the pick that stuck out most to me was John Mechie III, because I don't think there's anyone in the CFL outside of the BC Lions that think Mechie III is ever going to come up here. It would be a massive bust, and Mechie III just doesn't seem to have that bust quality about him. I get you want to make headlines, have something splashy to talk about, but I just don't foresee a situation where Mechie III ever actually plays any type of CFL football, let alone come across the border to play in Canada.
Yeah, I think that pick is probably the worst one in the entire draft, just in terms of value. You're not going to see that player. I think the likelihood is less than 10%, probably in the 1 to 2% range that you ever see him, just because of how highly thought of he is in the NFL, the role he's going to take on with the Texans, and what he can do. But I want to pound the table a little bit for the Lions here, because I thought they had the best draft, especially at the top overall, in terms of the talent they added. They needed to get more physical. They needed to get longer. They needed to add guys who could contribute on special teams. There were some desperate needs for this team, and I thought they addressed all of them. They get 3 Saskatchewan Huskies who are all going to be hard hat lunch pail players for them, and Nathan Cherry at number 3, Noah Zare in the second round, and then Riley Pickett later on in the draft. I thought all of those were fantastic selections. Josh Archibald, who can contribute on defense as a rotational pass rusher and brings special teams value. And then Adrian Green, the corner from St. Mary's, who's long and physical, a smooth mover. I think he'll fit really well on the Lions special teams unit to start off. And I think he can have a career where he exceeds where he was drafted as well.
We should move on. We're going to talk about Mechie in this segment as well at the NFL, but I will say, I think you boys are being a little tough on the Lions, because if there's ever a draft to take a flyer in round 7, 8 on a player, it's this one. And I don't want to sound disrespectful to the players who are otherwise taken in round 7 and 8, but frankly, I would rather have a 2% chance at a player of Mechie's caliber than some of the guys who, whether it's testing numbers or whatever, are just not going to compete for you at the CFL level. So I didn't think it was maybe a little bit, maybe you take him an 8 instead of 7, but I didn't think it was that egregious of a reach. And now you got, and hey, last I checked, BC also has the rights to Chase Claypool. So maybe this is just a trend they want to start. They want all the NFL receivers.
Will never come to Canada.
Who will never come to Canada. Fair enough. Fair enough.